Rich student broke a janitor's glasses for likes. What he does next left everyone crying. The boardroom smelled of black coffee and lemon polish. Light cut across the marble table in hard white bands. Men in suits pretended not to look at the two empty chairs at the head of the table, the ones reserved for ritual and power. The press wall outside the glass had already been set, logos printed, cameras warmed, a neat row of bottled water. Everyone had practiced their smiles. Bernard Kellerman was not on any guest list. He was there because the eastern hallway always collected dust, and because the mahogany on the conference table showed every fingerprint. He pushed a cart with a vacuum and a folded ladder tucked behind the canister. He had zipped up his thin jacket against the draft from the double doors, and wiped the soles of his shoes on a doormat that said, "Welcome," in a font that made the room feel friendlier than it was. His daughter, Molly, would be waiting at home with a candy wrapper and a picture she'd colored for him. That thought was a small, steady warmth in his chest as he crossed under the glass panels and into the room. He cataloged the little things the way janitors do: a coffee ring on the CEO's portfolio, a blot of lipstick near a water glass, a hair stuck to the edge of a coaster. He straightened a stack of corporate reports and set his hand on the chair at the head of the table to check if it was level. The leather was cool beneath his palm. She fell without warning. One breath. Then a sound like a snap. Alexandra Ashcroft folded like a reed gone brittle. Bernard was only 3 feet away. The world telescoped to her face. Pale, lips pursed, eyes not focusing. He forgot his own name and moved. He had been taught CPR in a community class years back, on a rainy Thursday the church offered for free. He had kept the certificate in his drawer, a small square of laminated paper he had once hung above his toolbox like a talisman. The training returned with muscle memory. Check responsiveness, call for help, then chest compressions. Everything else buzzed out. The boardroom became the hush between drum beats. "Call 911, someone yelled. A woman's voice, high and urgent. Bernard leaned down. The table scraped against the floorboards as 1,000 shoes lunged toward the central space. He set his hand between Alexandra's shoulder blades and found the slope of ribs. He pushed. His palms were rough, his wrists were steady. He pressed and counted under his breath. 1, 2, 3, until his arms burned. A young man in a blazer tried to pull him up. "Hey, sir, step back," he said, hands on Bernard's shoulder. Bernard ignored him. There was no time for polite instructions. He pressed again. He felt the thin, rented fabric of the suit give under his fingers. Alexandra exhaled, a small wet sound. Someone shoved. The shove was a thing of fright and hesitation, not of malice. But in the room, fear unplugs decorum and feathers fly. Bernard's glasses, simple, wire-rimmed, with one scratch on the left lens from Aunt Ruth's first kitchen knife incident, caught the force of a shoulder. The young man's elbow clipped the frame, and it folded like an old hinge. The rim popped. A lens split along a spiderweb crack and winked like fractured ice. "No," Bernard hissed, and kept compressing with one hand, the other cradling the broken glasses where they tangled with a fallen pen and a napkin. He felt the heat of embarrassment spreading through him as the room's instinct turned from attention to spectacle. A few people had their phones up. Someone's camera light blinked. The new angle of things made Bernard's movements look clumsy, like a mimicry of violence. He did not stop. He could not stop. The young man who had struck the glasses held a phone high, pivoting to capture the moment he decided would get him a laugh, a like, a more visible name. He was thin and arrogant in the way only money breeds, sure of permission, unaccustomed to being questioned. He smiled at his own screen as if he had given the world a joke. "Guys, get it. This is perfect," he said, and his voice had that bored joy that tells you someone is practicing scandal the way a musician practices scales. Some people in the room laughed, nervous and brittle. Someone else cried out, "Clear!" And a security officer moved forward with hands that were meant to move the crowd, not lift chests. Bernard did not look up to see whose hands were where. He leaned, he pushed, he breathed into Alexandra's mouth 2 rescue breaths, because that is what you do if they are not breathing, and then he resumed compressions. The paramedics arrived with noise and a professional intensity that cut through the chatter. They took over, palms efficient and unhesitating, and they connected wires and a bright clinical gadget that barked a steady, blessed rhythm. The crowd parted like water around a stone. Someone cried. Cameras kept filming. Someone else shouted, "Who is that? Who touched her?" Later, the clip would be trimmed and looped. Later, the voiceover would be selective. Later, the moment where Bernard steadied Alexandra's jaw would be cropped beside the frame showing his glasses cracking, making the composition look like a predation that never happened. In those immediate minutes, no one had the right wording. Bernard watched the paramedics work and felt something like the slow unmooring of a boat. The crowd's energy recast into a new shape, curiosity edged by rumor. He realized he was still holding one half of his spectacles when a security guard took them cleanly from his fingers and dropped them onto the floor like a used napkin. The lens skittered into a seam in the carpet. "You can't be in here," a woman in a pressed May suit told him. Her voice was the language of policy. "Sir, we have to ask you to leave." Bernard could not tell them that he had saved a life. He had his certificate, but certificates don't command rooms.
The paramedic touched his elbow, a brief thank you that felt like a band-aid. "Sir, we'll need a statement," one of the officers said. "Please come with us." They led him through a maze of glass that reflected a dozen live faces. The young man with the phone walked beside them, still recording, fingers going through the clip as if checking the lighting. He held up the screen and scrolled, found the frame where the lens fractured, and sent it with a flick. Bernard left the building with his cart abandoned in the hallway and a cardboard slip in a cold hand, a temporary suspension notice that the HR woman smoothed out like it would heal the crease. No one thanked him with more than a nod. Someone pressed a bottle of water into his hand with the contempt reserved for a mess cleaned up by someone else. By evening, the video had a life independent of the thing that had made it. The clip, less than a minute of grainy frames, dragged and rewound in pockets across the city. It was trimmed to the least descriptive second and then amplified, as all ugly things were, into a narrative that fit a headline: "Janitor accosts CEO." The comment streams were merciless. Screenshots of the broken glasses circled like a scavenger hunt. The young man's account pinged with new followers, whose delight was a little thinner than hunger. They had a thing to watch tonight. Bernard watched a version of what had happened, one constructed by pixels and intention. It was not a fair version, but the velocity of the clip turned fairness into a slow, helpless thing in the rearview mirror. He stood outside a coffee shop near his walk-up and watched his phone light up, each ring like an accusation. The messages were a chorus: accusations, calls for his head, demands for action. Some were cruel, some were mocking, some were solicitations for interviews that would pay, if not in money, then in infamy. He thought of Molly, small hands peeling off flour from the counter where she tried to roll bread, of the stuffed bear with one button eye. He thought of rent due in 3 days, and a landlord who did not like excuses. He texted her mother a short note: "I'll be home late." He tried to write it like a promise. When the HR email arrived the next morning, it was polite in a way that made guilt an object balanced on a scale. "Due to allegations of inappropriate conduct on company property," it read, "we must terminate our working relationship with you effective immediately. Please return all company-issued equipment. You are not to enter corporate premises pending the results of our investigation." The word investigation hung like a legal radiator, radiating heat without warmth. Bernard sat in the chair at his kitchen table and read the email over and over. The edges of the message blurred into the whiteness of paper. Janet from downstairs, who kept a casserole for him in case of bad weather, knocked and brought over a glass of water and the day's paper.
She had the kind of lined face that suggested she had once been good at forgiving. Now she kept her forgiveness tucked away like a savings account. "Call a lawyer," she said. Her voice was practical. "Call someone." He had $10 left in his wallet. Lawyers took money. They were not for people who were accustomed to living from week to week, who kept envelopes with rent tucked under a bent fork in their drawer. He stared at the termination letter until the words lost their angles and became a rumor he could not swallow. The smear metastasized. An anonymous email with evidence arrived at the press office, a screenshot manipulated to show his hand where it had been on her chest, and then a caption that was crueler than the image. A hastily convened statement from communications expressed shock and regret and promised cooperation with authorities. Nobody in that statement said thank you to the boy who had kept a pulse under his hands. On his 3rd day without hours, a man from collections left a colorful envelope on his doormat. It was an eviction notice in bureaucratic blue. The landlord had already stapled a copy to his door. The rent heater utility company left a pinched voicemail. Bernard put his only suit, a jacket he kept for church and Molly's school plays, back in a plastic bag above the closet, as if its fabric could absorb dignity. Molly watched him with the bright, painstaking attention of children who try to be small in the face of adults' troubles. She brought him toast with the crusts cut. She left her drawings on the table, dragons breathing hearts. The world they shared narrowed to tiny rituals,
a cereal bowl washed, homework under a lamp, a bedtime story. Bernard read the same 3 pages of the same book until the words made grooves inside him. The young man's video had a life all its own. He posted a follow-up clip where he laughed about the drama and said he didn't mean it between sips of energy drink, but regret on camera looks like a costume. His followers turned his apology into clickbait and layered speculation on top of it. Online, the thing to do is not to learn the whole story. The thing to do is to say something first. "Why are you looking like that?" Molly asked one night, pushing her small palms against his chest. She had borrowed his spectacles some days before to try on a pair of his jackets. He remembered the way she'd looked, how big and curious and silly she was in the wrong-sized frames. The memory hurt because it had an angel in the margins. "I'm fine," he said. And because he'd said it so often, it became a fact he could tell himself. They missed 3 nights of sleep. They missed dinners. They skipped a pizza night. The heater rattled in the small apartment like a tired animal. Janet came up a flight with a casserole, and a look that said she had been saving the casserole for worse.
She brought with her a stack of flyers for temporary gigs, moving help, a night janitor job at a parking garage, an offer to sweep a church basement for a small cash compensation. Bernard filled out a form online and got an email back a day later. Position filled. Another asked for a social security check, and he did not have the confidence to send it in a world where a single video could warehouse you like a defective widget. On the 8th day, the landlord's office called and said an attorney would post a notice if the payment did not come. It felt like a door being fitted with locks. Bernard slept fitfully, the day's shame looping like a cheap soundtrack. Outside his window, the city kept functioning. People brushed past his building in suits and sneakers. A cafe put out a tray of muffins, and a man in a tie sat with his laptop and did not lift his face to notice the life unraveling next door. Word crept into the company that the video's spin was paying rhetorical dividends. Board members called for damage control. Tyler Brigham, the CFO with a brand of charisma that wore like a shield, drafted a memo about company reputation. He knew how these things worked. Make a decision quickly, present a united front, keep markets steady. People were more likely to remember a swift response than a complicated truth. Tyler's hand hovered over the release template, and then typed a line about inappropriate conduct because it sounded authoritative. He forwarded it to legal. In the mid-morning lull at Alexandra Ashcroft's penthouse, that room humming with the sterile certainty of money, she woke with her chest tight. The hospital had given her a list of symptoms, the usual technicalities, arrhythmia, something that would need follow-up. But the dream was what lingered. In it she had been under glass, hands on her throat, a man's shadow over her face, breathing into her mouth. She could remember the rhythm of the compression in the dream, as if it had been a metronome counting a life. In the dream, the world outside watched through screens, faces pixelated and judgmental. At the company, they told her the story they had already curated. A disturbance, a janitor overstepping, a misinterpreted scene. They spoke of procedure like a rope someone throws when they want you to climb down quietly. She was to be a statistic in their public messaging, grateful for survival, careful to speak about team resilience. PR drafted a thank you message that marinated in warm colors. But something in the way Bernard's hands had felt, calloused and unhurried, would not let her sleep. She asked for the security footage. That made people nervous. Security liked to keep footage tidy, safe for auditor eyes and liability forms, not for CEOs who had nightmares. Tyler raised an eyebrow at the request. "You'll have to sign off," he said, smoothing a fold in his shirt. "We don't want leaks." "Let me see raw footage," she said. She drank coffee that tasted of bitter paper and watched Tyler consider. He blinked as if to say, "You are the one who asked to be seen." A CEO can get used to being the only person who was watched and watched back. She was used to influence. She had built an empire on it, but influence had never felt like this. Security handed her a mass of files on a flash drive. The first cut was clinical. Timestamps, motion-triggered cameras, the corridor cams. She watched the frames like a scientist. People move differently in video than in real time. Motion becomes a syntax. In one frame, Bernard is sweeping near the door, a small man in a blue jacket. In the next, Alexandra collapses. In another, Bernard drops to his knees. The footage was grainy, but it had a directness that the viral clip lacked. There was no joke in it. There was only the exchange of breath and air and rescue. Then she downloaded the phone footage from the student's account, one brief clip, jittery and intimate. The student's thumbnail posted a caption that winked at scandal. "OMG, janitor goes too far. #awkward." The student was smiling in the clip's preface, a half grin for an audience. In the middle of it, the frame where the glass is cracked was held, a cinematic freeze that let the snap become an accusation. In slow motion, the sound of plastic bending was loud.
Alexandra found the frame where a hand pulled at Bernard's shoulder, too forceful, a shove that was not needed. She rewound. The man's elbow clipped the rim. She watched the glasses fold. She watched Bernard continue compressions, stubborn as if he had a hinge in his spirit. Then security appeared and pulled him away, and someone shoved him into the hallway. Something in the footage made her stomach go cold, not because she felt threatened, because she felt like a blind person who had been led by strangers. The fact that someone had made her fragility into a spectacle and then allowed a man who had kept her heart beating to be erased, this was the thing that made her rage low and hot. She called Tyler. "What did you do?" she asked, voice low. "We followed protocol," he said, the implacable calm of an accountant who had measured risk. "You fired him?" "It was a temporary suspension pending an investigation," Tyler corrected. "But we had to act. The media was—" "The video is doctored with a selective frame," she snapped. The sound of her own anger surprised her. "Get me his name. I want his name. I want to know where he is." Tyler shifted, the sound of paper moving like a small animal. "You should let legal handle it." "No." Her voice made a small, decisive break. She had been raised to be in control. She was very good at it. Yet control now felt like a blunt instrument beside the fine, steady thing she had watched, Bernard's breath counting life. She could feel the shape of what was owed to him forming in her mind, and it would not form into the language Tyler offered. She ordered security to give her his contact details.
They hesitated, compliant to a corporate caution that prioritized procedure over personhood. One of the security leads, Marcus, a broad-shouldered man with tired eyes, handed over an address and a phone number. "We can escort you," he said, a professional offering a route that would pass through channels. "No," she said. "I'll go myself." She packed a sweater and the flannel scarf she kept folded like a quiet argument in her drawer. She did not want the company's gloved shoulders around her. She wanted to see a reality unmarred by PR. At his apartment, Bernard taped up a small card that Molly had colored and stuck it to the fridge. "For Daddy, I love you." It was written in thick crayon, the O of love, a planet. He tried to be necessary for her. He kept the eviction notice in his sock drawer and the termination email printed and folded into his Bible at a page with no verse. The staple of paperwork seemed to have lodged into his routine. He had not eaten properly in days. He had been to the clinic once, where a nurse took his pulse and said he was borderline dehydrated and referred him to a community intake. He had shrugged of the paperwork, because those forms make a man spend dignity like a currency he can never recover. He was wary of being angry in front of Molly. Anger stains rooms like oil. It was better to be small, to save the shape of his voice for later, when things could be managed. That night Molly fell asleep with her hand on his arm, as if she were holding him to keep him from evaporating. In the morning, the landlord's office left a new note. There was a small, unremarkable envelope with a crisp business card tucked inside, a reminder that the world had ways of organizing people it deemed disposable. Bernard taped the envelope back to the door, as if attaching it again could make it a notice that would pass him by, unless he stared at it with full attention. He did not want to be seen like this. Shame has a tactile quality. It sits on the skin like cold silk. At the same time, at a small cafe down the block, the young man who had filmed the first clip sipped a drink and watched his follower count rise. For him, the world had been rewarded. He posted another short clip saying he didn't mean and that he never wanted things to go far, and he smiled with a practiced remorse that cost him nothing. A generator of engagement had just learned how quickly outrage could turn into influence. Screens glowed and fed themselves on outrage. Phones in pockets vibrated with the news cycle. A morning show had taken the video and juxtaposed a panel of talking heads who argued with the same intensity with which they had once discussed quarterly projections. The language became simplified. Hero turned suspect. Assertion turned scandal. Bernard's name now jostled with tags and trending algorithms. Janet tried to help.
She took Molly to her own niece's school to sign forms and pick up a bag of apples, while Bernard filled out yet another application for a job that required references and a stable address. He wrote a careful note about the boardroom incident in the box that asked for, "Explain any gaps in employment." The words did not feel adequate. He applied for night shifts at a hotel on the wrong side of town. A woman called him in a flat voice and said they'd keep his resume on file. He applied at a school as a maintenance assistant. Someone asked whether he had any past behavioral concerns.
He hesitated and then wrote no. His honesty felt like a gamble. They immediately moved him into the pile the system uses to manage the unloved. Meanwhile, Alexandra found she could not unsee the frame of the broken glasses. The chest of people around her favored policies and logic and spreadsheets. These were failures to account for the human ledger. She had been taught that the market corrects and institutions govern. In her life that had been mostly true, until something that mattered more than profit, human life, was reduced to a single pixel that made the wrong story. She sat at the edges of her empire and felt the corporate language become brittle. She sent an email to Tyler with the single sentence, "Find him." She clicked send with a quiet that felt like an explosion. Tyler replied with a single line, "We are handling public fallout. This is delicate. We need to manage optics." Delicate, she thought, is what people call something they fear. She had the power to order things. The question she faced in the quiet of her own guilt was whether to use it to preserve a balance sheet or to bend it toward an individual. The thing she had watched a court of cameras try to erase had an urgency that made the spreadsheets unnecessary. She asked for more footage. She requested security logs. She demanded to know the chain of custody for the clip. Each demand was a thread she pulled from a sweater. The structure began to unravel enough to show seams. The more she pulled, the clearer the picture became. Bernard had stayed until paramedics arrived. Bernard had aided, not attacked. Someone had chosen the frame where the lens broke and held it like an indictment. When she saw the student's smile on the clip again, the smirk that had meant to make an audience, she felt a rare thing that was not anger so much as sorrow. The recognition that humiliation could be manufactured for consumption. She also felt a private sense of debt, not because saving someone creates debt in a ledger, but because she had been saved by the actions of a man the world was willing to erase. She saw himself in a loop, small acts of service churned into fed rumors, and then turned into the kind of justice that fit into a headline. She imagined Bernard's hands, and the way they must have felt soaked and warm with another person's life sweat, and it made the city seem carved in two.
Her assistant sent a tentative note. There are rumors he is homeless. There are texts. Her phone lit with a screenshot of an eviction notice. She swallowed and felt the world pivot. She had never wanted to be the person who could change the tide. She had built things that changed markets, but changing the life of a nameless man had not been on any spreadsheet she had ever balanced. She called Marcus, the security lead who had handed her Bernard's contact. "Find him," she said again. "Bring me his number. I want to speak to him." He hesitated. There are procedures, they told her. The weight of policy is a thing that binds hands. But Marcus was a man with an eye for real moments. He said he would ask around and see what he could find. He knew the stairwells of the city's peripheries and the faces of people who lived in them. Alexandra finished a call and stood for a moment in the quiet of her office. The city spread below like a soft grid of lights. A memory of the paramedic's compressed voice, working, precise, came back to her. She thought of the broken glasses, that small, cheap hinge that had become the artery of an ugly story. She thought of how you can be watched by thousands and still be invisible when it matters. At the same time, Bernard shuffled through a pile of bills and pulled out the one that carried a payment deadline in black, bold letters. He added the numbers in his head, as if the act of summing could make them less hungry. He looked at Molly as she slept, her thumb inside the corner of her mouth like a mollified anchor. He considered the world outside their window and the rush of it like a river at an unpredictable season. He did not know that a woman who presided over a large swath of the market had just decided to look at a video more closely. He did not know that the image of his fractured spectacles had become something that made people argue about who they wanted to be. He did not know that somewhere far above his tiny apartment, an executive had ordered Marcus to look up his address. He only knew he had to keep breathing for Molly. He only knew he had to make sure there would be cereal in the morning. He only knew that the plate he slid into the sink that night had a spider crack on the rim, and that imperfection made it more useful to him somehow. When Marcus's car pulled away from the corporate curb and headed into the shoulder of the city, the two worlds began a slow, inevitable motion toward each other. One of them carried a shell of policy and spin, and the other a carton of unpaid rent. The meeting of those things was a slow thing, like a clock winding down to a hand that points nowhere obvious. In the hallway outside Bernard's apartment, Marcus pressed the intercom in the way a man who has seen enough claustrophobic rooms learns to taste the politeness in his voice. The light in Bernard's window was a bare bulb, in the silhouette of a child's postered wall.
No one expected to change the shape of the world with a single knock. Inside the building, Bernard heard the knock and straightened automatically, smoothing the elastic of his waist. He moved to the door, not knowing whose face he would find. When the chain slid and the peephole spanned Marcus's broad smile, Bernard's chest tightened with a caution that was not new. He opened the door a crack. "Mr. Kellerman," Marcus said. He was careful in a way that suggested he had been taught to be careful for a long time, and not always in ways he agreed with. "Yes? My boss asked me to bring you this." Marcus extended a manila envelope, and the city seemed finally, absurdly to exhale. Inside there was a copy of the company's original statement, printed and stamped. But more than that, there was a simple piece of paper, a contact card with a name he did not recognize. It was Alexandra's direct outreach. She had written no words, only signed it with a title that felt like a bell. Bernard's fingers folded around the paper, like they could compress it back into a single, unreadable fact. He felt something like suspicion. Like anyone raised to have the bottom line near the surface, he trusted outcomes less than promises. "Why would she?" he started. "Maybe she wants to say thank you," Marcus said. "Or maybe she wanted to fix something. Or maybe she wanted to open an investigation. Or maybe she wanted to make amends that could not be made." The possibilities each felt like an animal behind glass, dangerous, watchful, uncertain of the shape they would take when finally let loose. Bernard looked down at the broken rim of his glasses in the envelope. The lens had a spiderweb crack still visible through the clear wrapper. It looked small and meaningless against the scale of his life, and yet it was also a pendulum. Someone had wielded it like a syllable to shape a story. He touched that crack with a tentative finger, and felt like a man touching a small memorial. "How can I help?" he asked Marcus, more because it was the question his father had asked when storms came, than because he was ready to accept anything. Marcus shook his head. "I don't know," he said, "but maybe she does." The door closed with the soft click of a hinge. The envelope lay on the kitchen table next to Molly's picture of a dragon whose heart breathed fire. Bernard sat down and folded the paper slowly. The city hummed and the world continued its transaction in dollars and in air. A small, improbable thing had arrived. A line drawn by a woman whose life moved among boardrooms had reached him. It was not resolution. It was a beginning. He felt both hopeful and cautious. Alexandra's car threaded through streets that smelled like winter and fried food. She did not wear the usual armor of a press-ready suit. She carried no company driver. She wanted in the movement the quiet of a person who needed to see. Her hands on the steering wheel were steady in a way unfamiliar to her. The memory of Bernard's palms, the precise rhythm of his chest compressions, kept returning like a phrase in a song she had once forgotten. She had never been moved to act like this for someone she did not already statistically owe. It was a strange indignation, less about guilt than about the refusal of a system to see what had happened. She had been taught to compartmentalize. Now the compartments had leaks. She parked a block away from his building and walked the rest of the way under light that smelled of damp and hot iron. People looked at her in the way people look at people who have halos, curious and antsy. A man with a cart of bags gave her a longer glance. She felt the distance between their lives like a physical measure. Alexandra knocked on the door with a certainty that was not arrogance. She was not used to being in the presence of strangers without the buffer of attendance. When Bernard opened the door and recognized her face, the person he had helped, something in both of them shifted toward a conversation neither had expected to have. "I wanted to thank you," she said, the words simple and direct, but the weight behind them was something else. He could tell she meant more than courtesy. Bernard swallowed. He was suddenly thoroughly aware of the oven mitt on the counter and the way Molly's picture leaned into the card he had just received. The door was a threshold between two economies of life, the economy of power and the economy of survival. Both of them understood the ethics of the threshold. "I don't need thanking," he said, because that was what a man who had kept a child alive says, as if the act of keeping a life is its own reward. She rested her palm on the doorway and looked past him into the smallness of his world. "You don't get to be erased," she said, "not when you've done this." His eyes narrowed and then softened. She had watched footage. She had seen the frame. She was admitting something that had already concretized as a rumor into the shape of a promise.
There are people who refuse to be made into images for other people's entertainment. Bernard could have been suspicious. He could have closed the door. Instead, he stepped aside and let her into the room where a child's dragon smiled at a man whose glasses were cracked in a neat spiderweb. When she sat with Molly on the couch for a brief, awkward conversation, Molly hugging the stuffed bear like a small, decisive live thing, Alexandra learned less about procedure and more about what habit and quiet affection weave. It was not dramatic, it was not viral. It was what a life looks like when someone decides to keep it together for someone else. It was, in a word, ordinary. She had come with paperwork in case she wanted to act. She had come with questions she would file under other questions. She had come with a private annoyance for the world that would choose spectacle over fact.
She had also come with a small corporate language she had to unlearn in front of a man whose life had been reduced to a pixel. Outside the windows, the city blinked. Inside, two people found themselves in the same modest orbit, neither of them yet certain what restitution could possibly mean. The envelope lay on the table between them. The cracked glasses caught the light, the spiderweb like a map. Bernard watched Alexandra watch his life. He felt the scales of fear and hope shift slightly. "You didn't have to come." "You didn't have to come," Bernard said before he could stop himself. The words were not ingratitude. They were the bearing of a man who had learned to expect the world to look away. "I wanted to," Alexandra answered. Her voice was a careful thing, no press filter, no quarterly gloss. She sat a little too upright on the couch, like an executive trying not to sink into a life outside charts. Molly watched them both, wide-eyed, the stuffed bear clutched tight as if it could steady the balance in the room. Bernard folded his hands in his lap. The cracked lens peered up at the light from the window, the spiderweb catch reflecting the afternoon in fractured arcs. It seemed ridiculous and perfect, a small, ordinary object holding within it the geometry of everything that had happened. "Why would you—" he began, and then stopped. The question was too large for the narrow space of his throat. Alexandra looked at Molly and then back at him. "Because every now and then someone brings you a truth you can't put into a memo," she said. "I wanted to say I'm sorry, in the way that means something beyond the words." She took out an envelope from her bag and set it on the table. It was not the same envelope Marcus had delivered. This one was thicker, official, and had the clean weight of institutional attention. Inside was a short notarized statement, a clear typed account of what the security footage showed. She had written the first line herself and had the company's counsel add the legal language that made denials less palatable. Bernard read it slowly. The words were simple, a correction, an emphatic account of his actions, a clear statement that he had been detained in error during his life-saving efforts. Her signature at the bottom looked like a small promise. "It won't fix everything," she said, "but I can at least start by making sure the record is correct." It was such a modest thing that he could almost refuse it. He had been trained by grief and by low ceilings to make his latitude look small so it could be contained. But as he watched Alexandra's face, the small lines around her mouth when she tried to be ordinary, his suspicion loosened. "How will this change things?" he asked finally. "It will help," she said. "I'm going to put it out, with my name attached, and I want you to have a conversation about options. Housing for Molly, medical care for these last days, and I want to talk to HR in a way they won't like." Bernard swallowed. The words hit him like a soft landing, then a weight of consequence. People could still... He stopped. The fear that a thing that started as gratitude could be turned into pity running across his face. "We'll make sure the truth is visible," Alexandra said. "Not because I can buy credibility, but because I can force people to look at the footage they already have and at the policies they used to hide behind. That's what I intend to do." Outside, somewhere downtown, the young man who had filmed the clip watched his phone. His follower count blinked and jittered like a thermometer. He posted a small apology the night the corporate correction began to surface, an apology that smelled faintly of PR. But in this scene, he was background noise, a small current compared to the slow, deliberate weight of someone in power deciding to shift the balance. Alexandra did 3 things before she left the apartment. She arranged for a doctor to come that evening to check Bernard's dehydration and get him into proper care. She had a social worker lined up who could help with emergency housing. And she told him she wanted to speak to him again about a longer-term role. Each promise was a portal. Each risked being a release or a trap. "Why would you do all that for me?"
Bernard asked again, as if the question had a different tenor when he repeated it. He asked not only for himself, but for the child curled on the couch, who had already learned that adult words were fragile promises. "Because it's the right thing," Alexandra said. "In public and privately, it's the right thing. And because I want the company to look like it answers to more than the market." Her phrasing, careful, considered, sounded like a line pulled from a playbook. Yet there was a real softness beneath it, an odd humility in its power. For all her wealth and the toughness of her skin, she had been unsettled by the idea that a life could be reduced to a frame in a clip and then discarded. A doctor, a woman with a calm voice and a fold of tired humor, arrived that night. She checked Bernard's pulse, a pragmatic kindness, and told him he had been running on fumes. The community clinic could see him in the morning for a more thorough intake, and the doctor wrote prescriptions without fuss. The red ring around his knuckles from tense sleep dissolved a bit in her competence. Alexandra arranged a small guest room at a service apartment near the clinic for a couple of nights. It wasn't a mansion, but it was a bed that didn't creak, and the idea of not having eviction notices posted under the gap of his door felt like a tidal shift. For Molly, there was a small backpack with crayons and a voucher for a school program she could use next week. For Janet, Alexandra left a handwritten card with the number of a person who could arrange home help through the company's new charitable fund. As Alexandra left, she told Bernard quietly, "I'll correct the record. I'll push."
"But you need to know this. I'm not making a PR move. I'm trying to make space so people don't get washed away by a clip." He watched her go with a wary gratitude. She had not promised to fix the city or the machine that made the viral clip more powerful than his life, but she had opened a small door. The company's initial reaction to Alexandra's private intervention was the thing expected: procedural alarm. Tyler Brigham read the signed correction and saw the communications risk in a new light. There was a meeting, glossy, urgent, in a glass room downtown where Tyler spoke with smooth, controlled irritation. "We need to limit damage," he said. "If the CEO goes public with a statement that undermines HR's actions, we risk a trust deficit. The board will ask questions." There are different kinds of power. Tyler preferred the kind measured by charts and the way numbers bent into narratives without visible hands. Alexandra preferred a kind that could be used to correct an injustice when she saw one. They argued not like adversaries, but like two people fluent in different languages of responsibility. "What if we present it as a correction of the record, not an indictment?" Tyler offered, his voice a damper on emotion. "No," Alexandra said, the line of her voice skimming steel. "We publish the footage, we correct the record, and we offer support to Mr. Kellerman. That's it." Tyler's mouth flattened. He sent an email that night, a thin aroma of condensation, instructing legal to prepare a release that would be carefully worded. He was not cruel, he was cautious. But caution can be its own kind of cruelty when the people affected are not the ones who write the memos. The release hit the public sphere the next morning. Alexandra's statement was brief, direct, and attached the security footage in full, not the trimmed clip. It said nothing sensational. It said instead, with quiet force, what the footage showed, that Bernard had rendered aid until professionals arrived. It included her signed notarized account, and it included an offer of support for Bernard and his family. The effect was sudden. The 1,000 small narratives that had sustained the smear began to fray. People who had been quick to comment had little to offer when the full frames told a different story. Some influencers who had amplified the clip quietly deleted their posts. Others, less nimble, doubled down, offering conspiracy theories. The algorithm, ultimately a machine without moral sense, still followed attention, but the presence of a named voice clarifying the record changed the anchor of the story. Online, the young man who had filmed the clip tried to pivot. He posted a longer apology, filmed in a kitchen with bad lighting, where he said he hadn't thought, and that he regretted how his post had been used. There were comments that were sincere, and there were comments that were savage.
The young man's followers shrank, not because of institutions, but because attention is fickle and encourages replenishing audiences with fresher anger. For Bernard, the correction meant something practical. HR cleared him officially. The termination language was walked back into a suspension that the company then closed with a statement of regret. A debt of reputation was acknowledged in a way that allowed him to hand back his termination letter and receive an actual apology, typed, stamped, and delivered, along with a token payment for lost wages. It did not replace the nights they had slept on empty stomachs, but it stopped the legal machinery from worse forms of invisibility. Yet not everything changed overnight. A smear leaves sediment in a life that takes time to scrub. Some people who had been asked to sign off on the quick response were still defensive. Tyler, ornamental though he was of smoothness, quietly tried to stanch the flow of other reforms. He circulated memos that emphasized precedent and reputational risk, tools that can be used to preserve existing structures at the cost of the vulnerable. Alexandra pushed through. First, she terminated the security leadership who had been careless with chain of custody protocols. Then she fired a communications lead who had chosen the trimmed clip for broadcasting without adequate verification. These were not theatrical acts of vengeance. They were, for her, necessary preservations of the company's moral baseline. She also submitted a plan to the board, an employee welfare initiative designed to create a fund for emergency housing, to train non-executive staff in crisis response, and to ensure open access to legal counsel for employees who were publicly implicated. Tyler pressed back. He forwarded an internal memo suggesting that the initiative was a costly diversion from shareholder value. The memos were dry weapons. Alexandra countered with testimony from Marcus and the security team, and she asked Bernard if he would consider joining the advisory board of the initiative, only as a voice, not as a figurehead. Bernard's initial response was reflexive. No. Pride has the same reflex as self-protection. He had been invisible for so long that the idea of a seat at any table made him uneasy. To say yes meant stepping into a glare he had been trying to avoid. To say no risked letting the thing that had nearly erased him remain unchanged. The next week, while the company's internal wrangling continued, Bernard's life changed slowly in the practical ways Alexandra had promised. He stayed in the service apartment for a little while, and Molly slept with the dread that had collected around the doorframe. Janet had help coming in for a few hours to clear her small living room and to get her groceries when she needed them. A social worker helped Bernard set up a payment plan that postponed the immediate lock the landlord had been preparing.
In the evenings, he read stories to Molly without the gray knot of shame tightening in his chest as often. He went to the clinic and sat under a fluorescent light that smelled faintly of antiseptic and the soft human smell of continuity. In that place, he was a number and a person at once. His needs were taken on with a kind of organized compassion he had not expected. When Alexandra first asked Bernard to consider a formal role, designed not as charity but as a serious appointment to shape the welfare program, he laughed in a way that could not be characterized as fully joy or entirely scoff. "Why me?" he asked. It was not humility, it was a practical skepticism. "Because you were the person in the footage," she said, "and because you know what it feels like to be erased. I don't want to hire consultants who write nice slides. I want someone who's been there to tell us where the traps are." It was a careful offer, a paid position, advisory and operational, with funding to get it started and with authority that would require real work. Bernard asked for time. He and Molly lived within the cadence of recovery, and part of him measured his worth by the daily necessities he could keep. Tyler tried to undermine the appointment quietly. He suggested a committee of executives and outside consultants. He intimated that letting a non-degree-holding janitor shape policy was risky. The suggestion had the flavor of elitism wrapped in caution. Alexandra, who had learned a few things about leverage in a boardroom, made clear where she stood. "We are convening the advisory board next Wednesday," she announced. "Mr. Kellerman will be there." The day of the meeting, Bernard arrived in clothes he had cleaned until they looked respectable enough to sit among other people without arousing pity. He was nervous. Executive offices smell like citrus and air in a way that makes ordinary pain feel immodest. Around the table sat HR leads, legal counsel, and a few board members who had the practiced arrogance that comes from always having a voice in a room. Tyler took the seat 3 down from Alexandra and watched with a smooth expression that concealed an irritation. Bernard listened first. He told them about the things he saw as a janitor, people who fell through the cracks when things got ugly, a culture that assumed the right story was the one that fit the press release, and a silence among staff who feared consequences if they spoke up. He told them simple things, like how the company's emergency protocols assumed staff would have resources, and how that made no sense for someone who was paid hourly. He spoke without theatrics, with the plainness he had used all his life to keep rooms clean and calendars honest. He told them too about the cracked glasses. "They were broken while I was trying to save someone," he said. "I held on to them because they remind me that small things can be used to make big lies. I kept them because I wanted to remember what they tried to do with my life." That sentence made the boardroom quiet in a way no chart ever did. The folks in suits are trained to measure silence as a space to fill with narrative advantage. This silence did not request spin. It asked for attention. "What do you want us to do?" Alexandra asked, looking at him like she had watched him band someone back to life and now wanted to band the company into doing the same. He suggested practical things, a fund for emergency expenses, a hotline for employees to get legal counsel within 24 hours if they were publicly implicated, a protocol where raw footage is made available to independent review before public statements are issued.
He asked for dignity to be a metric measured alongside market share. They argued, some of them politely, some of them with the low-grade hostility of people whose jobs are to allocate risk. Tyler kept raising the cost forecast, but many on the board, shocked perhaps into seeing reality by the simple evidence of footage, listened. Plans that are right often feel uncomfortable for those who must change to accommodate them. Alexandra used the force of her position to set the program in motion with a budget and an advisory board that included Bernard in a formal role. The press covered the announcement in cautious tones at first. Company creates welfare program after viral misstep, a headline that fit into the current appetite for corporate redemptive narratives. But under the headline, there was a detail. A man named Bernard Kellerman, the janitor, would be on the advisory board. The detail made the story a little harder to reduce to a soundbite. The smear's reach did not simply disappear. Tyler tried to circulate a brief that suggested spinning language about risk, and a few news outlets, hungry for controversy, asked pointed questions. Someone dug up a decade-old parking ticket from Bernard's name and framed it as evidence of dysfunction. That kind of cheap digging is easy work for a culture that prefers short narrative to long truth. Alexandra countered not with fury, but with documentation. She released the security footage and her notarized statement publicly. She made a short, measured video in which she explained that the company had made mistakes in how it handled the initial fallout, and that they intended to do better. She named names where it mattered, transactional small names like the communications lead and the security officers who had disregarded protocol, and she put the company's money where her mouth said it would be. The fund was funded, and the program had an initial salary line to hire staff. People criticized her for being performative. They criticized her for making amends. The paradox of public life is that both critique and praise can accompany the same action. Alexandra accepted it. What she would not accept was the erasure of the person who had kept her alive.
The weeks that followed pulled at Bernard in ways both ordinary and extraordinary. He met with staff and lawyers to shape the program. He was given a small office, a real email address, and a secretary named Fiona who had a way of making administrative tasks look like scaffolding rather than bureaucracy. He learned to say yes to meetings and to read slides. He learned to edit policy and language that would not sound like charity but like safety. He argued for covering temporary housing for hourly employees with emergency pay, and he won that measure by a narrow margin in the advisory board. But there were private costs. At times he had to remind himself to breathe when the cameras found his face. At times his hands shook with the memory of being pushed, and of the phones held up that had turned the most crucial act of his life into a spectacle. He kept the broken glasses in a shallow box on his desk, wrapped in a handkerchief he had bought years ago. He touched them sometimes in the evening when the office emptied, and the hum of air systems alone filled the room. They were a small relic. Then the company's public conference for the Employee Welfare Initiative was scheduled, a national stage, attendees from other corporations, a moment that would either be another PR cycle or something more. Alexandra asked Bernard if he would speak at the podium. He hesitated. He had not wanted the exposure. He had not wanted to be a figure. He had wanted, above all, the dignity of quiet life. But a different thing tugged at his chest, the thought of the many who had no voice at all, the janitors who swept corporate lobbies while their own lives were unearthed by microscandals, the workers whose moments of crisis were treated like content for strangers. He thought of Molly and wanted her to see that her father could be more than a headline. He agreed. On the morning of the conference, the auditorium smelled of polished wood and expensive coffee. Reporters lined the aisles, and executives in neat ties found their rows. Fiona, gentle and efficient, smoothed the hem of his jacket and handed him a small slip of paper. Notes, nothing more. Alexandra stood to the side of the stage, a quiet presence that steadied like a hand at the back of the room. Before Bernard walked on stage, there were brief remarks about the program's framework, the budget, the partners, the timeline. The crowd applauded for the measures they could quantify. Then Alexandra introduced Bernard, with no fanfare, only a simple sentence. This program exists because a man who kept me alive was almost erased. He will tell you why we created it. Bernard's steps felt like keys struck in a piano, deliberate, necessary, a sound that made music from risk. At the podium, he lifted the microphone. He saw Molly in the front row, fist curled around a woman's hand that had bought her a small bouquet before they left the apartment. There was a breath, and he began.
"I'm not used to speaking," he said, and the auditorium leaned in, because when ordinary people start sentences with that phrase, we lean in to hear the truth. I was taught to make myself small so that trouble wouldn't see me. Today, I'm going to tell you something the cameras didn't show. He paused, then reached into his jacket. The box with the glasses was small, and he had wrapped it in the handkerchief, still smelling faintly of his life. He drew it out and set it on the podium. The room caught the light on the spiderweb crack. For a second, the object was only an object. Then it became a symbol. "These glasses were broken in a boardroom while I was trying to save someone," he said. The sentence landed not as accusation, but as a knot of fact. A small thing, an elbow, a phone, a cheap edit, turned that moment into a story that tried to make me into something I was not. He touched the rim, the place where metal bent. They could have been used to make a joke. They were used to try to sell a narrative, but they are still mine. He looked out into the crowd, letting his gaze travel like a searchlight. "I wear them now because I want people to see that small things can tell big truths. When I put these frames on, I don't feel humiliated. I feel like I am wearing evidence of a life that was almost erased. I wear them for my daughter. I wear them for the janitor who will be watched and judged one day. I wear them so we can stop letting cameras decide who we are." The auditorium was a room that contained 1,000 quiet private distances. The silence after he finished was not purely silence. It was the intake of breath of people who had been given reality instead of a curated story. A few heads bowed. Some in the crowd wiped their eyes. They were people who had been quick to tweet and now felt small. There were others who had been indifferent and now felt moved. Someone in the third row began to clap, then another. The applause built, not as a roar of spectacle, but as the clap of people acknowledging truth. It was the exact, modest kind of recognition that doesn't erase pain, but says, "We see you now." Alexandra stepped forward and joined him at the podium. She did not speak for him, she stood in solidarity. The press cameras pivoted, and the faces of the reporters registered a story that had a center: a man who had kept someone alive, a CEO who had chosen to correct the record, and a company attempting to do better. In the weeks after the conference, the program rolled out slowly and with the kind of bureaucratic slowness the world requires when changing systems. The hotline was staffed. The housing fund approved its first recipient. Bernard was given the title of Senior Advisor for Employee Welfare, with a small team and a real budget to work. Fiona helped him with calendars and contacts. He learned to write proposals that did not sound like pleading and to read audits that looked like safety.
Tyler left the company eventually, not as a result of a dramatic firing, but because board dynamics shifted, and the language he preferred, measured and conservative, became less persuasive in the face of clear moral and reputational risks. He took a new job elsewhere, where the risk appetite matched his. He was not a villain in cartoon terms. He was a symptom of a system that preferred the smoothness of predictable governance. The young student faded from the front pages and returned to a quieter life. His apology remained a thumbnail clip. He lost some followers and gained some, an outcome that felt like the soft justice of attention, fickle and inadequate. Bernard never sought to punish him. Justice, for the purposes of this story, meant restitution and a lesson about what it costs to reduce a person to a frame. For Bernard, the work of restoration was not linear. There were days when the weight of being watched made him retreat. There were nights when the old shame returned in the small hours, and he sat on the edge of the bed and whispered apologies to no one. There were moments, too, of slow joy. Molly on the first day of school with a lunch paid for by the company grant, Janet receiving a check that meant she could fix her heat, a janitor from another building calling to say the hotline work had helped the son of a coworker. The broken glasses remained a talisman. Bernard had chosen to have them repaired rather than replaced, so the crack would still show, a small line of trajectory across an otherwise functional frame. It was not a fetishization of pain. It was a deliberate decision to keep visible the mark of what had happened so it could not be easily spun into a joke. The first time he put them on a non-stage day, he felt like a man who had chosen a scar as his witness. The world, often ungrateful and fast, did not always notice, but the people who mattered did. Molly sometimes tried them on like a grown-up, and she giggled when the frame sat too big on her face. She liked the way her father looked in them, proud and quietly strong. Months later, as the program began its second year, the company commissioned a report documenting the changes in employee safety and the number of incidents addressed via the new fund. There were graphs and measures, the kind of language a corporate board likes. But the appendices had human names, workers who had been assisted, a short paragraph about a family supported in an emergency, a note about policy changes in the communications team regarding handling raw footage. At the report's public release, the company made clear that culture can be changed only if the people in power choose to see the people who do the work. Alexandra, always cautious, had learned something the hard way. The practical thing to do in this life is sometimes the moral thing, and the moral thing often improves the practical one too.
She still fielded questions in interviews about shareholder returns and compliance, but now those conversations included a new line: how the company cares for its least visible employees. Bernard's life settled into a new rhythm that was not, ultimately, spectacular. He had a steady paycheck from his advisory role, which meant the landlord no longer left curt notes on the door. He signed a contract for a small apartment with a washer that did not leak and a closet big enough to hide his winter coat. He bought Molly a small lamp for homework and promised her, on a Saturday, that they would get ice cream when she finished her painting. These were daily promises, ordinary and weighty. One evening, long after the conference and the memos and the early weeks of media attention, Bernard and Molly stood on the modest balcony of their new apartment. The city spread out in a map of distant lights. Molly leaned against him and traced the line of the broken rim with her small finger. "Daddy," she said, the way a child sometimes articulates the truth without knowing its shape, "why do you wear them when they're cracked?" He smiled, a small, tired curve. He had learned to love the question because it allowed him to say aloud what he often thought. "Because," he began, and for a moment, the words felt too simple to hold the entire history. "Sometimes a broken thing tells the truth. People saw me as something else because they only watched a tiny piece. These glasses remind me of what I did and of what happened because of it. They keep me from pretending everything is okay when it's not. They remind me that some things are worth fixing, and some things need to be visible so we can fix the systems that break people." Molly nodded, a seriousness in her face that did not match her years. "Do you feel better when people clap?" "Sometimes," he said, "but the claps don't change everything. That's why we started the program, so someone else won't be left without help when a clip goes wrong. People will have somewhere to turn." They listened to the city for a long while. In the flat below, a radio played jazz. Somewhere, someone laughed. The broken rim caught light and held it like a small jewel. Alexandra called that night to ask if Bernard would come by the office to meet with a community partner. "No big meeting," she said. "Just coffee. I want to hear how it's going." He laughed softly. "I'll be there," he said. "Bring no one famous." "You're the famous one now," she replied, and in the way she said it there was both irony and a quiet admiration that felt like a handshake between two people who had learned how to be human in different rooms. When he arrived at her office, she had a small cup of coffee waiting and a notepad with real, practical items. She did not speak in market speak. She asked about Molly's school, about Janet, and about the holes he'd seen in the safety net.
They plotted slow changes, the kinds that take time, partnerships with local shelters, training for security to preserve the chain of custody for footage, and annual audits that required community representation. At the end of the meeting, as they were both standing and the afternoon light folded across the glass, Alexandra placed a small box on the table. Inside, wrapped in tissue, was a new pair of spectacles, simple frames, but with a small, deliberate crack in the left lens recreated as a design feature. She had had them made to match the shape of Bernard's old frames, but in a way that was not a replica, an acknowledgement without appropriation. "For Molly," she said, "so she can keep yours safe if you ever want to take a day off." Bernard took the box and felt tears press at the back of his eyes in a way that was not showy, only real. "Thank you," he said, and the words were not about the object. They were about the fact that someone had seen enough to imagine how to heal. The story spread after that in smaller, quieter waves. The janitor who had saved a CEO was now advising on employee welfare. The company had instituted new policies. A program had been funded with real money. The headlines that followed were kinder, or at least more measured. There were op-eds about corporate responsibility, about the dangers of instant virality, and about the dignity of work. But the real change was less dramatic. A janitor who once felt erased, now advising a corporation on how not to erase people. A daughter who could sleep without counting pennies. A neighbor, Janet, whose heat was fixed and whose life felt less precarious. At an event a year later, a small group of employees and community members gathered to mark the initiative's first anniversary. Bernard took the podium and lifted his glasses, the repaired pair with the visible line, and looked at the faces in the crowd. He thought of the first breath he had given to Alexandra the day she collapsed, and of the small, terrible, and tender violence of a clip. He thought of a young man who had sought likes,
and of a city that had 1,000 small stories folded into its grid. "If anything good came of this," he said, "it is that we realized how quickly we judge and how slowly we act. We have to be faster in helping and slower in condemning. We have to build systems that see the people who clean our floors and feed our coffee machines. We have to remember that dignity is not an expense, it's a foundation." People in the crowd cried. Some wiped their eyes with napkins. Alexandra stood to the side, hands folded, a small, stubborn relief on her face. The program awarded its first scholarships that day, and a small grant to Janet to start a community kitchen. There were real names and small miracles tucked into dry budgets. When the event was over, Bernard walked out with Molly and Janet and a few others to a small diner across the street. They sat at a booth and ordered pie. It was ordinary. It was everything.
Later that night, at home, Molly asked if he would refuse the glasses one day. "No," he said. "Maybe one day I won't need them to remind me, but today they help me remember who I am and what small things can mean. I'll keep them as long as they help me do the work." Molly nodded, content. She fell asleep with her head on his shoulder, and the small lamp on the nightstand casting a soft halo across her crayon dragons. The world beyond their window continued to turn, sometimes cruel, sometimes kind. The viral clip would live on campuses and as a case study in communications classes for a while. The young man who had turned a save into a spectacle learned in small measure the cost of attention. The company kept its program and expanded it slowly. Lives that might have been erased were instead supported. On the balcony months later, Bernard watched a bus pass beneath, its passengers anonymous and full of private stories. He ran his finger along the spiderweb that crossed the left lens and felt the small ridges. The crack was not a wound anymore. It was a map. He had been seen. He had been heard. He had been given a role to prevent others from being turned into fragments of entertainment. He slid the glasses up his nose and looked down at Molly, whose eyelids had fluttered in sleep. "We did it," he whispered. Though he knew the work would not end, it was only a beginning. If this moved you, share this story to spotlight the people who keep our world running, and consider subscribing for more stories of real lives, restored and remembered.